5, 4, 3, 2.5.
Are we live?
You were just about live. Okay,
I see the live button on the top left, so I'm gonna.
Okay, I think we're live.
We are. Okay, yeah. Great. All right, we are live. So, hey everybody, welcome to the Multiversity project. Today we're here with Emma Leigh. She's a St. Paul-based activist and journalist who's been on the ground covering the George Floyd protests. After the murder of George Floyd by a police officer, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota have been at the epicenter of what many people see as a mass uprising in the US. In just the past couple of days, the cities have seen mass protests, riots, looting, the burning of several buildings, and the takeover and burning of a local police station in response to police brutality and racial injustice. There are a lot of rumors surrounding what's going on at these protests, including talk of white supremacists, Antifa, out-of-state instigators, and police initiating violence and sparking the riots. So we're very thankful to have Emma here with us today to hopefully shed a bit of light on what's been happening on the ground in the Twin Cities. Thank you for coming on, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, welcome again. To start off with, would you mind giving us just a brief background on the circumstances that have led up to what we're now seeing in Minneapolis and St. Paul?
Sure. It was a week ago yesterday. So ironically on Memorial Day, which has been part of the conversation at most of the events that I've been to, on the day that we are supposed to pause and recognize people in a somber way, we lost George Floyd on that day. As I'm sure most of your viewers have seen the video and seen images of what happened that day, one officer was seen kneeling on George Floyd. He was saying, I can't breathe, calling out for his mom. There were other officers standing nearby. Ultimately, George was killed that day. And very, very quickly, the community responded with mass protests. The first day it started outside of the location where George was killed. Cup Foods is not Cub Foods. We have a chain here called Cub Foods. This store is called Cup.
Yeah.
It's been a little confusing for some people.
In South Minneapolis.
Yes, in South Minneapolis. And then a large, massive crowd gathered there and marched over to the 3rd precinct, also in South Minneapolis. Minneapolis is large. There's different precincts, which are the different areas that different groups of police are assigned to. So the 4 officers worked with the 3rd precinct. So the march went there. And then over the next couple of days, a lot of the protests were centered right there at that precinct at the corner of Lake and Minnehaha in South Minneapolis. Things spilled over into St. Paul. For those not familiar with the Twin Cities area, St. Paul and Minneapolis are both cities and they're right next to each other. So there's a large metro area with 2 actual cities. One is not a suburb of the other one. They're 2 cities next door. And then in Minneapolis, things spread down Lake Street quite a ways over to another precinct building. And a few things have happened in North Minneapolis since then. And there's a lot of action happening now, mostly peaceful things at the governor's residence in St. Paul, as well as the state capitol, which is in St. Paul. So we've got a lot going on here when I look at a map and try to think about what's happening where. There are all different kinds of people are out locally right now responding to this for a large number of reasons all across the metro area.
Yeah, you mentioned a large number of reasons. Do you see this as, well, Minneapolis and St. Paul have kind of a history with police brutality and other incidents. Do you see this as connected to those things and also potentially related to the coronavirus lockdowns at all, or?
Definitely. I think it's all related. I think that it's sort of like a perfect storm just happened. We reached a tipping point because there's frustration because of the coronavirus lockdown. People have been stuck inside. Here specifically in Minnesota, it was cold in February and March, as it always is. And then this lockdown began and people weren't moving outside as freely as the weather improved. And we normally have like street festivals happening this time of the year. And people are there's a lot of angst just from being stuck inside, and then add to that the people who are unemployed right now because of the lockdown. Just everything related to the lockdown that is happening has increased a lot of frustration and added to the overall vibe here in the Twin Cities and across the country. But you mentioned the history with police brutality here. I know a lot of people probably don't remember where the people that have been in the news who've been murdered by police are from, unless you're from that area or associated with that area. But a lot of the names that have been bigger stories in national and international media over the last like 5 years or so actually have been around here. We had Philando Castile was murdered by police just north of St. Paul in a small suburb. He actually he worked at the school that my kids go to. There's a lot of the community right here that has Philando signs still up in their houses. Jamar Clark, and some of you might remember, I think that was back in 2015, that the community occupied space in front of the 4th precinct in North Minneapolis. After that happened, he was actually murdered just down the street from the 4th precinct, just a few blocks. And that's where those officers worked. And the community occupied the land and the street in front of the building for weeks. There were people camped out there 24 hours a day. There were meals, there was mutual aid. It was amazing to witness that. We also had Thurman Blevins more recently, Justine Damon. There's just been so many. There's so much momentum and anger here because there is that history. So everybody that's out there right now is out there because of George Floyd, but they're out there because of this list of people that have also been murdered by the police in the Twin Cities and across the country, as well as the people who have just faced police brutality here. Dying because of the police is a bad thing, but that's not the only thing that's happening. There are people that are beat up by the police. There are people that are just the aggression from the police, the policing of certain neighborhoods that doesn't exist in others. There's a lot behind all of this, in addition to the dynamics because of the coronavirus lockdown. When I've been out on the streets looking at the graffiti, there's a huge increase in graffiti in some of the neighborhoods where this stuff is more centered. And it's a lot of stuff about George, a lot of stuff directed at the police, a lot of the names of other people that have died, but there's also a lot of tagging directed at capitalism. I've seen some tagging. I've seen Jeff Bezos sprayed painted on things. There's a lot of anger about a lot of different things right now that's all coming to a head in this moment. The murder of George Floyd was like just the spark that ignited something that was already kind of ready to blow, in my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense. I know we want to ask about a lot of those different groups or potential players that might be tagging and out there later. But one thing I wanted to ask first is, Ariel and I, well, we've all been hearing a lot of rumors, or maybe not just rumors, even politicians are saying that the protests in Minneapolis and St. Paul are being infiltrated by white supremacists. Have you seen anything that would indicate that, or could you speak to that at all?
Well, one thing that my initial response to that when people started talking about that, and I've also seen this at a lot of the events that I've gone to, people are repeating that white supremacy was already here before these things started, that it didn't take this protest to happen to suddenly have white supremacists infiltrate the Twin Cities. They've been around here. It's been, it's everywhere to some extent. So depending on the perspective of the people that are talking about it, some people are talking about like it wasn't here and they're coming in from wherever, but there's been that dynamic that people have been dealing with. There's been signs and stickers around the Twin Cities that I've seen with my own eyes over the past few years. It's not a brand new thing that's happening now. I have no doubt that people are coming in from other places right now. When I've been driving around, I see plenty of license plates from out of state. But that's also normal. There's people here. 2 months ago, there were people here from out of state too. But just because people are coming in doesn't necessarily mean that they're coming in to instigate these things. But there are a lot of warnings about, hey, there's white supremacists that are coming to where we are right now. We have to disband this gathering that we have. And you guys are probably pretty aware of misinformation that happens online and bots that prop up things. And the other night there were lots of warnings that the KKK was spotted in various locations, and I never ended up seeing any actual confirmation of that happening at that time. That seemed like something that maybe just started online and bots were promoting it. So it's really difficult to get a handle on exactly what's going on with some of the outside groups in real life versus what you're seeing repeated online.
Okay.
But I definitely have no doubt that there are different people around here that have different goals and want different things to happen, some better than others.
Who do you see as like being responsible for those bots?
I'm not sure. It probably when I was out for the 4th precinct occupation, back when Jamar Clark was killed, some of that stuff was actually happening then, and I feel like it was less common around then, but there were rumors that were starting on 4chan about people that were in the area that wasn't true at all, but it was causing fear and to some extent some chaos in the group because nobody knew exactly what was going on. I know that there are probably people just at home online that like to cause chaos and cause misinformation, sometimes organized, sometimes not. But that's not something that I've looked into a lot myself right now. I'm just seeing like little bits of it, and people are giving me screenshots of things. I'm trying to file them away and in my brain to try to go back to later and figure all of this out.
Hey, interesting. Yeah, it definitely does. It would make sense for keyboard warriors to be playing a role. I mean, it kind of leads into something that I think a lot of people have been wondering about. Like there's been kind of reports of like possible agent provocateurs. It seems like there's been confirmed like undercover cops and talking about that possibility. So have you seen any evidence of that?
Well, the Umbrella Man, are you both familiar with that person?
Yes.
Who was the first one to break windows at the AutoZone, dressed in all black and had a black
which later
umbrella.
burned down.
Yes. So I did not see him breaking the windows at the AutoZone. I did actually film him before that. I saw him on Minnehaha Avenue dressed the same. I think it was him, or it was somebody purposely dressed exactly like him, also with a black umbrella, similar backpack. I can't say for sure it was the same person, but if it wasn't the same person, I don't know how there were 2 people that were dressed exactly the same unless it was planned that way. Picked up a very large, like, brick. It was bigger than a rock. Put it in his hand, put it in his pocket, and made his way up to the front of the crowd. I was back a little bit at this point, and on the other side of the precinct from me, there was a line of riot police or police ready there, and I followed his umbrella, and I was live streaming the whole time, and I was talking on the live stream. I see this guy with a black umbrella that picked up a big brick, and he's walking up to the front, and I just had a feeling that this guy's going to go up to the front, he's going to throw that, and the police are going to respond and retaliate big. So I was actually kind of backing up at that point already, and that's exactly what happened. I followed his umbrella till it got to the other side, and then I can only imagine that he threw it. I couldn't see at that point, but that's when a bunch of the first tear gas came out that day that pushed everybody back into the parking lots. And that's actually what started the looting of Target and some of the stores back there, because people got pushed into the parking lots and went into Target to try to get milk and supplies, and Target wouldn't let people buy things, and it just escalated from there. So having seen that person do that and follow that, and know that that was happening, and then later get home and see these things about Umbrella Man and the AutoZone, that seems incredibly suspicious to me. I obviously I can't say for sure what was happening with that, but there are people who have come forward and tried to say who they think this Umbrella Man is, and I don't think that any of the authorities have fully explained why they don't agree that that person is Umbrella Man. You know, they can say no, but we need evidence that this is not that person. We need this to get looked into.
Right.
And
Have you heard some people have been saying that an ex-wife of a police officer has been sharing that, you know, this is the Umbrella Man.
Yeah.
Do Do you give any credence to that, or?
It's impossible to know right
Sure.
now, but that's something very much worth looking into, and it's something that we can't trust the police department to look into. You know, the St. Paul police said no, we don't agree with that, but that's not enough right now. Nothing that they're doing with that event or that semi tanker that drove through the crowd the other day. The police are not saying why they are deciding that someone didn't do something, that someone isn't someone. They're giving us, at a time when all eyes are on what's happening here, we need more information from the authorities if they're going to make a decision and say, no, this was not the man who threw the rock or broke the windows or whatever. Tell us why. Don't just say no.
Right.
That's not good enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's definitely not satisfactory.
Mm-mm.
We've kind of been covering a couple of these different things, but it seems like there's an interaction of many different groups with many different agendas out in the protests and later like the looting and the riots.
Mm-hmm.
People have talked about Antifa, the Agent Provocateurs, Umbrella Man. The mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul said that it was all out of state opportunists, and then they went back on that.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, like, what's your interpretation of the looting and kind of the interplay of who's, you know, who's involved in that?
Mm-hmm. So there's a quote or like a phrase going around a lot that I've been seeing that I think is important to think about, that the protesters are protesting, the looters are looting, that we don't need to lump everybody into one thing. You know, the people that are out there for George and that are angry about certain things aren't necessarily the exact same people that are doing the looting. I also like to keep in mind the psychology of what happens to people in groups getting caught up in things, and you know, somebody might loot right now and it wouldn't have ever been something that they would have ever thought they could do, but they're caught up in what's going on. So there's a lot of dynamics at play right now with who's doing what and why they're doing it. But I have a friend who 3 nights ago, time doesn't make sense right now. I'm looking at the calendar and I'm like, I don't know. I think 3 nights ago, he was in St. Paul as part of a group just protecting his neighborhood. A lot of people are doing that right now, just kind of patrolling at night, even though it's past curfew and they're not supposed to be out. They just want to have eyes around and see what's going on. And he happened upon three teenagers. They were 3 white teenagers that probably lived in his neighborhood that were leaving a building that he had just heard was potentially being set on fire. So they went to go check out the building. He chased after these kids because they wouldn't stop to talk to him. He wanted to know, are you involved in what's going on? And they just ran and they kept running. So it seemed suspicious to him. So he wanted to find out more. And in that specific moment, that was a neighborhood that is not quite as close to some of the other areas where things are happening. And it appeared to be just 3 teenagers that have been out of school since March because of the lockdown. 3 teenagers who are watching what's going on the news and potentially went into their own neighborhood to just kind of get into trouble because there's a curfew and they're teenagers. It's a thing that might happen. In North Minneapolis, a couple of buildings burned on Broadway. These are buildings that are like staples in the neighborhood. They're not necessarily buildings that people that live in North Minneapolis would just go burn, probably. Of course, I can't speak for exactly what's happening and who is doing what, but City Council member Jeremiah Ellison, who lives there, has also spoken about this because this is his area of the Twin Cities, that there haven't been protests in North Minneapolis, but there have been a couple of fires, and there's been smaller fires that community patrols have found that have put out. And the biggest thought about that right now is that people from the outside are coming in to North Minneapolis to start a fire, that it's not the actual community starting the fire there.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that North Minneapolis is like a largely Black community too. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that might be an area where people could suspect white supremacists coming in.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. I wanted to ask a bit about the police response and how you've perceived that. I know you had an experience of police shooting at cars and you shooting at some people you were with. I don't know if you want to talk about that or other things.
Yeah. First, I do want to highlight, and I don't want to sound like I'm pro one police department or something, but because we have these two cities here, Minneapolis and St. Paul, it is a world of difference, like night and day in the two different cities. I have spoken with St. Paul police. They've approached me when I was photographing things after curfew to check my credentials. And they actually pointed out during that moment that there is a difference between St. Paul and Minneapolis police, and they wanted us to recognize that difference. The St. Paul police are not blameless. The St. Paul police have killed people. But in this moment right now, as a journalist especially, I feel much, much safer in St. Paul than I do in Minneapolis in terms of my interactions with police. And then as far as the police go in Minneapolis, Wednesday, so Monday was the day that George Floyd was murdered. Tuesday was the first big protest that went from the location of his death to the precinct. During that time, tear gas was fired eventually on that crowd. There was no dispersal warning given before that. I've talked to plenty of people that were there and have been to many protests in the Twin Cities over the years, and they said they have never experienced a time when they have not given instructions or a dispersal order or something before responding in some way. So that happened quickly. He was killed on Monday. The police responded and used tear gas on Tuesday. So that was a very quick escalation of their use of force and their attitude, the way that they were setting this up. And then on Wednesday, I was out in front of the precinct during the day, and it was before any looting started. I believe it started that day with that target after that big tear gassing. And that night is when the auto zone was up in flames. But during the day, at one point when I was standing on the street in front of the precinct, not around anyone else, I was just photographing, filming what was happening and taking pictures. A flashbang was launched right at me. I think it hit the ground in front of me. My leg got really hot, and then part of it ricocheted, and I have a bruise on my leg from it. I don't know exactly how it happened because I was running out of the way at the time, but that was on Wednesday. So we've got very quick escalation from the police right from the beginning. And then we're still having these things continue. Like you mentioned the other night, I was in Minneapolis on a street corner. I had followed a march, and then I wanted to get back to our car because the curfew had already begun. And knowing that the Minneapolis police had been actually targeting what appears to be purposefully targeting media, I didn't want to be very far away from our car and our supplies. So we left the march to go back to our car, brought it closer to where we knew that people had been surrounded by police and some arrests were being made. We knew someone who was in that group, and we were getting information from them. So we wanted to get closer, and we got as close as we could, and we happened upon a police line. They were blocking off the entire street. So we parked there, and we talked to the handful of people that were in the area. There weren't very many people looking at this police line. The people that were there a lot of them were kind of tipsy and just yelling at the police and kind of running up a little bit and running back, nothing threatening. There were cars that were driving quickly up to the police line, but that's because the police line was not at an intersection. It was set back behind the intersection. And it was in a place where if you crossed that intersection, you had nowhere to turn. It was just the police in front of you. There was no parking lot. There was no alley. There was no other street to get away. So if you were just coming down the street full speed, driving, and it's nighttime, they didn't have a lot of lights on, you might get up to it too close before realizing what happened. And then once you realize it, all you can do is back up and get away. We saw cars do that a few times. And then one car drove very, very quickly up to the police. I wasn't filming at this point. Somebody was standing out of the sunroof yelling as they drove up to it. And it was very scary because we thought the car was either going to hit them or they were going to shoot at this car and that person standing up was going to get injured. They ended up driving all the way up and slamming on their brakes and then being able to leave. But after that, every car that drove through that intersection, the police began firing on them with rubber bullets. And it was darker at that point, so it was even harder probably for people to tell with their depth perception. We know there's some flashing lights up in front of us, but where exactly is it? How much time do I have before I have to turn or whatever? So people were coming up through that intersection, and once they'd get through the intersection, about halfway closer to the police line, they'd start firing nonstop, just pop, 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 a bunch of rubber bullets.
Wow.
And then the cars would back up and their windshields are broken. And then us, as the people watching, we want to make sure these people are okay. Some of the people that I'm with are getting angry at the police because they see what's happening. We see that it looks like a trap. We're trying to warn these cars as they drive up and they don't know what we're doing. We're just yelling at them from the corner so they keep going. We try to get a little bit closer and then the police start firing rubber bullets in our direction too. So we don't know if we feel safe enough to go up to the cars to check on the people. One of the first ones that it happened, it was an older man and he backed up and his windshield was shattered and we're asking him if he's okay. And he really just looked like he was in shock. He was just, I don't know if he said anything to anybody. And then eventually he drove away. And that just happened with every car that came by. Right before I left, there was a car with kids in it. And it happened to a car with kids in it. And so we had to check on that car and make sure that everybody was okay. And at one point, a car drove by, it turned in time and he rolled down his window and he wanted to know how to get out because it turns out that the National Guard had other streets blocked kind of behind us and to the other side. So he felt trapped. He didn't know how to get out of this maze that had been created in the area. And it turns out that he was one of the people who had been in that circle that got arrested. He was in jail for about an hour. They let him out back in that area to his car, but then let him out in this maze of police. So you have these people that are probably trickling out of having been in jail for an hour. Who knows what state they're in after that experience, and they're just letting them out in the middle of this maze. It was very, very concerning to see that it looked like a trap and that those of us on the corner were trying to stop people from driving. That shouldn't be our responsibility. The police line was in the wrong place. I understand that they might feel threatened to have cars driving up to them, but that's their fault for putting the line where it was. They could have easily advanced themselves, parked more vehicles in front, right where that intersection was. The only way I can describe it is that felt like a trap.
Wow.
And then they could have really hurt people in these cars. And now this is less important because the safety and well-being of the people is most important, but things are closed all over the Twin Cities. It's relatively chaotic in different neighborhoods. Now we have these people with smashed windshields. It's illegal to drive with a cracked windshield. This was unnecessary to do this to however many cars. I don't know how many more cars it happened to after I left, but it was just a constant stream of like car drive up, smash the windshield, car drive up, smash the windshield. It was very wild to see.
Wow. I definitely want to ask more about that. I'm noticing we're coming up on time. Are you okay to stay another 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay. One thing we've been wondering about, I think we'll have, is how have the protesters been dealing with the coronavirus risk in that whole pandemic situation?
Yeah. So there's a lot going on that's impacting the way that people are able to deal with that right now. Towards the beginning, and I still see it now, there are masks being handed out pretty consistently at every location I've been to people that don't have them. Somebody with just like the paper surgical masks is going around also with water and with other mutual aid. There's a very visible effort to try to get a mask on everybody. But then when the police are being aggressive and people are having to run from police, people are pulling their masks down so they can breathe. When people are getting tear gassed, they're taking their masks off so they can breathe, and then they're coughing. So I know there's definitely a big divide in how different people perceive the coronavirus threat. But the general perception I get here is that people are trying to be careful. People are conscious of it, but the tear gassing and making people run away is making that difficult for people to keep up with it here. And the tear gassing and doing things that are irritating people's respiratory systems is also, if they're telling us to be careful and to social distance in the middle of this and to make sure everybody's wearing masks and to be scared that as our cases are increasing in Minnesota, don't be in a big crowd. But then the police are tear gassing people and making everybody cough and irritating. This doesn't all fit. It doesn't all work together. But I do see a big effort on the part of organizers and the medics and people on the ground to make sure that everybody is staying safe and healthy as much as possible.
I just wanted to ask one more question, if I can, about what life is like for, well, protesters, but also just everybody else in these neighborhoods in Minneapolis right now. Because like you said, it's a lot of chaos. A lot of stores have been burned down. How are people responding to maybe the lack of access to food and transportation and the curfews and things like that?
Mm-hmm. So I've seen quite a few different things trying to help all of these problems. The impact of food shortages have really hurt the neighborhoods that have had most of the fires, because Target was affected, an Aldi grocery store was affected, Cub was affected, all close together. So that was all of the food for that neighborhood. Other stores have shut down preemptively because they don't want to be looted or burned down. Other stores and restaurants are boarded up, but they actually still are open, but it's hard to tell. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how to get supplies and where. And with public transportation shut down, then people can't leave their neighborhoods to go get these things. But there is a very big effort for people that are able to, in the metro area as well as in the suburbs, to either go out to the stores that are open or come from where they live out in the suburbs and bring supplies in. There are all across the Twin Cities areas where people can go and pick up supplies, where supplies can get delivered. There's a very conscious effort on trying to get what people need to these neighborhoods. In terms of transportation, I've seen, at least within protests that are mobile, especially marches that go a really long distance, that in the middle of them or towards the end, there are some vehicles driving around with signs that say, "Do you need a ride?" People know that are involved that public transportation is not accessible. Even if it were, who knows what that would be like right now with so many people trying to go places. So there's a big effort of trying to get people safely back to where they need to be, especially the last couple of days. It's been very, very warm here and very humid and very sunny. So it's not necessarily good for people to march a really long distance and then have to march all the way back safely. So there is some effort there to transport people around. There's also a lot of the marches have been followed by cars too, probably to take some people back at the end, but to be there if someone is unable to continue the march and then unable to hop on a bus afterwards. So these are things that are being thought about and helped, but obviously there's so many people being affected. There's so many people participating in the marches and the actions. So many people in the neighborhoods that now don't have access to gas stations and to grocery stores. So there is that effort. I don't know if it's enough right now, and I don't know how sustainable that will be in the long term, but it's really great to see that it's happening right now, where the government is unable or unable to, but not providing for people, which, as you know, it's happened across the country just in the midst of the lockdown. Before all of this started happening last week, there are hungry people, there are people who can't access what they need, there are people without money, and humanity, mutual aid, humans have really stepped up to provide for each other outside of these systems that are just inadequate and not taking care of anybody.
Well, that might be a good note to end on. Hopefully a more optimistic process. Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to ask before you sign off, are there any, other than yourself, we'll be linking to you in the description, and Emma's been out day after day live streaming, so definitely follow her to follow what's going on in the Twin Cities right now. But are there any organizations or anything that you would want to highlight, people that are doing good work to maybe follow or help to try to address these situations?
Every time I see something, I boost stuff. So if you find me on Facebook, look through my last couple of posts, and I'll be sure to post some more about that today, because I've actually heard that there's some pretty bad thunderstorms on the way right now. So there's probably not going to be too much to go out and do right now. But if you find me there, I'll add some of the people that are doing some of the best work on there right now. A lot of it is not very organized. It's just communities coming together. It's just a neighborhood that decided to start collecting things. And the need seems to kind of shift every once in a while, but I'll get a list together and maybe like pin it to the top there so people can come back and find out how they can help.
Great.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, this has been great. Really appreciate it.
Much appreciated.
And if you like this, please share this content, anyone who's watching.